Okay, hi everybody. Welcome to another episode of the Method to Our Madness podcast. I'm Stacy Marola, PhD, and I'm here with my co-host Bill Pate.
Hello.
And just to give a little bit of a preface for today's episode, for people that might not be aware, in the last year, due to a lot of federal funding cuts, a lot of evaluators, they sort of lost their jobs. Say it otherwise, they lost their jobs, they lost their contracts. Even those that weren't actually sort of working directly for the federal government or as federal contractors, those that were working, let's say they were doing a grant evaluation for a nonprofit, and then the nonprofit loses their federal grant, and so they would lose their contract. So this has brought up some concerns about the future of the field and training folks for futures careers in evaluation. And so to chat with us today, we're bringing back John Hitchcock from the University of Minnesota, and who's also brought with him a couple of his colleagues. So I'll let John introduce himself.
Thanks, Stacy. So yes, I'm John Hitchcock, and I'm an evaluation studies professor at the University of Minnesota. And as Stacy said earlier, this is actually my second go around with this podcast. The last time I was on, I focused on mixed methods research. I think I'm running out of things to say, so I brought friends. So I'm going to hand this off to Dr. Jody Benenson, and if you would, please say hi.
Hello, and thanks for the opportunity to be here today. My name is Jody Benenson, and I'm an associate professor at the University of Minnesota in the Department of Organizational Leadership, Policy, and Development, and have the privilege of serving in the Evaluation Studies program. I've been at the University of Minnesota for the past 8 months and am really looking forward to talking about the future of evaluation.
I'm Stuart Ye, professor and coordinator of the Evaluation Studies program at the University of Minnesota. I've been there since 2002, mainly focusing on teaching courses in program evaluation and pursuing scholarship regarding evaluation. So in the past, I previously worked at the Manpower Demonstration Research Corporation, where MDRC worked on large-scale demonstration programs, demonstration and evaluation programs, mainly in the area of welfare to work programs. So I worked on a evaluation of the California Greater Avenues to Independence welfare to work program, the federal job opportunities and basic skills program, and a couple of programs, one named New Chance, a demonstration program for unwed mothers, and the Parents Fair Share demonstration program for non-custodial fathers. So that's just a bit about myself.
Well, now I feel like I should have said more about myself. Briefly, I've been doing this work since 2003. That's actually how long I've known Stacy. And like Stuart, I've been around randomized control trials, and as I mentioned earlier, I think my best work is in the mixed methods realm.
So yeah, you guys have been wrestling with this issue of like, well, how do you train, future evaluators? I guess what are your thoughts so far?
Hmm. So I'll ask my colleagues to weigh in this as well, but I see sort of two large things hanging out there. The first one, Stacy, you've already described, which is right now we're in a tumultuous period where funding is a concern. There's questions, and I certainly know lots of colleagues who have lost work in the applied side of evaluations. And the other large issue that's out there is how do we think about generative artificial intelligence and its role as we continue down the path of evaluation, and what are the implications for things like accessing data, analyzing data, dealing with so-called hallucinations, worrying over how one might use AI for understanding literature bases, producing visuals reports, and things along those lines. Jody and Stuart might have other big picture items that are out there, but again, from my perspective, I think to summarize, there's uncertainty in the funding world, and what do we do about AI?
Well, I would say a few things. I think that the underlying needs that clients have, evaluation clients have, are unchanged, regardless of the funding environment. But I think what they're looking for are evaluators who can think deeply about what works in addressing critical social problems and can understand the implications for program evaluation. I think that clients want a problem-solving partner rather than an auditor on their team. And this has implications for how we prepare future evaluators. So one of the things that we try to do is we try to inculcate good habits. For example, I often ask my students to focus on problem diagnosis. Do existing strategies and approaches misdiagnose the problem? If existing practices are based on a misdiagnosis of the problem, they are unlikely to be effective. And so it helps to have a strong understanding of alternative ways of attacking a problem, thinking about what are the most promising alternative strategies. Are there case examples of highly successful programs or practices? One example I can think of is the Delancey Street Foundation, which operates numerous businesses staffed by individuals with histories of substance abuse, homelessness, and as ex-convicts, individuals who typically have tremendous difficulty obtaining employment. And the Delancey Street Foundation has a remarkable record of success where other programs have failed. And so what does that say about conventional diagnoses? I think it suggests that conventional thinking is perhaps incorrect and there's a better approach. So if you're a program evaluation professional who is asked to perform an evaluation of a human service program that serves individuals with histories of substance abuse, homelessness, and as ex-convicts, it's helpful to have a working understanding of the Delancey Street Foundation and why it's successful, so that you know what questions to ask and what data to collect. So what you do as an evaluator changes when you are aware of alternative strategies for attacking a social problem. So I was just talking with Stacy before we started the podcast about the need to ask new evaluators and even experienced evaluators to think deeply about what is not going well, to the extent that program evaluations are maybe less effective than we would hope them to be. They're not leading to more effective programs, but just to promote that deeper thinking.
So yeah, so you think there's hope for the future, that there will always be a need for evaluation?
I do. And in fact, we have students coming into our program who are transitioning from other careers, related careers, but they see evaluation as a promising area or a new direction to their career. So, and a lot of people, I think you mentioned, a lot of people sort of fall into evaluation as a career. So they start out, they're educated in other areas or maybe a particular content area. They're focusing on public health programs or public affairs or education. And then they decide, really, we need to know how to improve these programs, how effective they are. And so then their interests gravitate towards program evaluation. And so then they decide maybe they need a credential. So then they come to our program to pursue a degree.
That's true. People don't tend to wake up when they're 6 years old and say, I really want to be an evaluator when I grow up. And
Right. Yeah.
So you're saying that did not happen to you, Stacy?
it didn't happen to me. Maybe it happened to you, but it didn't happen to me.
But absolutely. And, to Stuart's point, we're really fortunate to have so many students who do bring their both lived experiences, but also prior professional experiences to our programs, which is fantastic. And also in these times, we really need to be thinking about how to train students to be adaptive to the times, which of course means, understanding evaluation theory and models and a whole host of methods, but also understanding program theory in a way where, when we're actually thinking about, I don't know, like when we actually are thinking, if we're providing a recommendation, for example, we not only need to, understand from an evaluation perspective what recommendations to provide that are practical, but we also need to understand the programs. And so I think we're in a situation where we need to be thinking about the combinations of skills and competencies and dispositions that are beneficial for evaluators right now. So they have a good understanding of not just how to evaluate programs, but how to provide recommendations that are actually practical and mission-based and effective for, like, including, nonprofit organizations, for example, but also have a good sense of the policy landscape so they can understand what types of recommendations to provide in that way. And I think a lot of, my thinking around this comes from my background in public administration and policy, really recognizing the power that comes from having methodological, theoretical, and very practical applied program and policy knowledge.
Yeah, I definitely like this discussion where it's going on this topic because it does demonstrate that there is a wide spectrum people who call themselves evaluators or, have accidentally come into this, by a different profession. And it does illustrate that, when we're confronted with the possibility of like AI taking away, jobs and things like that, I think with like any real endeavor, to Stuart's point, if there is deeper thinking and consideration, and so one of the things that I've been getting into is more of a systems approach. And so that's been useful to force the deeper thinking to come up with, better recommendations that are well thought of rather than the superficial, almost auditor after the fact role that a lot of times people are asked to be an evaluator for. They've already collected the data. It's over. There's nobody to interview. There's nothing to follow up on. Here are some documents that we have, and oh, we happened to ask this silly survey that had 200 questions, and can you do something with this? And you're not a partner in that instance. You can't really, help them truly make it better. You're just kind of doing that auditor thing or, post hoc stuff. And it's like, well, if this is really what you want, somebody could do this for you, but maybe, I'm not the person for it. And you can just explain it that way. Especially if there's an opportunity for like another funding cycle where it's like, well, here's all the things we could have done differently, or you should think about doing maybe differently if we're brought in early enough. So I definitely appreciate that, the deeper thinking and that type of an approach. Thanks.
I've had fun working with Stuart and Jody around the deep thinking part of this when it comes to evaluation because I don't take credit for this observation. Actually, I forget who said it, but universities in the United States and in Europe are they're basically medieval, right? I mean, the universities as the basic model has been around since people would carry swords and whatnot. So at the same time, if you're a faculty member, you're supposed to be an innovator. You're supposed to be doing things that are new and different. And if we conduct an evaluation, what did we learn that's new? If we have an innovative methodological approach, we assume that we're doing something that's differently from what has been done in the past. So that there's an inherent paradox there, right? We operate in a world where we deal with these old ideas like tenure and teaching and running lectures. Yet we're also supposed to keep thinking about what comes next and cutting edge thinking. So to deal with that paradox, you do have to be a deep thinker and you have to pay attention to the landscape and see what's coming next. And I'm not saying I'm great at that. I might in a moment demonstrate that I'm not, but I'm seeing what's happening. I'm actually kind of optimistic. I do think we're seeing tumultuous funding patterns, but since I joined the University of Minnesota last August, I've still been somewhat inundated with proposal activity. I'm still able to work with contracts, and it's harder, but it's not impossible. And as an optimist, I think that some of the headaches that we're dealing with right now are based on human decisions, and some of what we find ourselves dealing with is temporary. And I think that those of us who are persistent, and that's pretty characteristic of most good evaluators, because most evaluations I've run into requires an element of persistence. Hang in there. I think that we're going to see in the funding realm some improvements, and it will look different. But if you're flexible and you can evolve, I'm thinking if we take a longer term view, 2, 3, 4, 5 years, those of us who hang in there are going to stay busy.
Bill, you mentioned a systems perspective. And I think about that a lot because most of the social problems that we have been with us seemingly forever. And we have programs to address those problems, many programs, but the problems remain. And so the question arises, why do these problems persist if we have devoted so much attention to them? We have so many programs to address them. We have program evaluations of those programs, and yet those problems still persist. And so from a systems perspective, one might think, well, there are systematic reasons why those problems persist. And so there might be some type of a feedback loop that we haven't fully understood, but there's something about these problems that we have not accurately diagnosed. We don't fully understand why these problems persist, because otherwise we would have already developed effective programs and we would have solved these problems, but we haven't done that. And so that raises real questions about what we need to do differently in terms of preparing evaluators to think differently.
Yeah, and this is one of the reasons I love working with young people. A lot of my research and evaluation work is around training the next generation of evaluators. And it's always exciting, when a college student or even a high school student, gets excited about evaluation. We are all excited when young people get excited about evaluation. When you have the 6-year-old, who is waking up and saying, I want to be an evaluator. Unfortunately, that doesn't happen as frequently as we'd like, nor should it happen as frequently as we'd probably like. But I think, yeah, to answer these huge social problems, we need to be relying on the next generation to figure out both what the solutions are and then how to come up with these solutions. And I mean, I think about young people, within the context of evaluation and trying to figure out what some of these answers are and in these very complex systems. And I think about young people as some of the first people to experience, new systems, whether that is AI, in specific contexts, or new hiring models that are taking place in evaluation spaces or digital public services, the nonprofit sector, et cetera. And young people aren't afraid to challenge outdated metrics and models and theories. And so I think, we do really have an opportunity and a responsibility to be listening to the next generation and co-creating what the future looks like together. Because, if we're not kind of training newer generations, we're continuing to ask, I don't know, ask these really big questions without an important demographic, and it can really, I think, help create the pipeline. And I wish, I hope that we can be as optimistic as John when it comes, to the future of evaluation, but we're going to need help, and we need help of the generations that have both come before us, and then also to be listening and inviting and co-creating with those that we have a privilege and a responsibility to work with. So, yeah, I think about that a lot.
Jody, I'm so glad you like working with young people. I hope that's not a dig at me and Stuart.
Young is a construct. We're all youthful.
We're all youthful. So what tips would you guys have for, young people thinking about this as a career now at this point? Like, what should they be focused on? I mean, you mentioned deep thinking. I don't know if there's a way to unpack that.
I think that artificial intelligence, both Bill and Jody mentioned artificial intelligence, AI, that is the new frontier. It is a tool that has just superb potential for helping everyone in doing their jobs. And evaluation is not an exception here. So AI has tremendous potential. It can be used to identify alternative ways of thinking about a problem and the right questions to ask, but AI can also hallucinate. So you have to be aware of its limitations. You have to know how to use it properly, and you have to educate yourself about how to interact with it, because you don't just ask one question and get an answer. Instead, you typically start with a question, you receive some sort of an answer, you ask another more refined question, and then through this iterative process, you gradually arrive at useful information. So understanding how to refine those questions is a skill that has to be learned. And so this is a piece of advice that I would give to aspiring evaluators is to learn how to use AI, learn the strengths and weaknesses. But it is a skill that has to be learned. And I think we're just getting started with this new frontier. There's a lot to learn. There are a lot of pitfalls. You have to understand how to train the AI for certain applications. Sophisticated scripts have been developed that can be borrowed and used with good results. Otherwise, you essentially develop a script through your interactions with it as if you're mentoring a research assistant. You teach it how to think about a problem, you save the script, and the AI remembers it. It's very much like training a research assistant. So if a research assistant is well trained, then you get useful output. But if the research assistant is not well trained, you won't get useful output. At Minnesota, we're launching an initiative to train our students how to write problem statements and conduct literature reviews using AI. The initial workshop session will walk students through the use of Claude AI and Consensus, which is a plugin for Claude. Consensus has a script that is specifically designed for literature reviews and helps to avoid problems where the AI hallucinates or provides weak output. So that's an example. Again, we're just getting started in how to think about AI properly, how to use it properly. There's still discussions and debates about how much we should permit students to use AI when they're writing their written exam papers and so on. But it is great potential, and I think all of us have to keep up with these developments. It's part of the future.
Yeah, I was just at the American Education Research Association. It was in Los Angeles, and it was a weird experience because there are an awful lot of robots around. There are robots that were delivering things, and those little boxes on wheels, and it looked like they had little electronic faces. I took a Waymo for the first time. I was kind of afraid. The first few days, I saw a driverless car in downtown LA, and after about day 4, I got curious and took a ride for the fun of it. And I also sat in a fairly long training session around AI applications in social science research more broadly and education research. And to build on what Stuart was talking about, I did run into a model that I'm kind of enamored with because it's got 3 parts. I find I tend to think in terms of threes because if you get into fours, it gets too complicated for me. But the threes, there were the 3 Ps in this presentation. One was focusing on your purpose. What are you doing? Why do you need AI? Or if you don't need it, why are you using it anyway? So what's your purpose? The other P was the product. There are different AI tools that are out there nowadays. They're going to continue to change. And so much so that when I write about this, I don't pay that much attention to a tool name because I'm pretty sure things will get outdated quickly. But yeah, products that help you understand existing material like Notebook LM, or you have products that can help you find things like Research Rabbit. And then the other P, to get to the third thing, is your prompt. That is, how are you interacting with AI? What are you giving the right prompt so that this tool can help you? So within that, product, purpose, prompt. And if you get those 3 things interacting in a smart way, then I think as an evaluator, you're using your AI system pretty well. And if you mess one of those things up, then you're probably not going to like the experience.
John, when you describe your experience navigating LA and engaging with all these different forms of technology, I mean, I think you presented so many skills that I think, going back, like Stacey, to your question, like are important for evaluators. You were curious, right? You were like,
Mm-hmm.
you saw these different forms of technologies walking around. I regularly see robots delivering food on campus and usually walk in the other direction. So I commend you for getting into a Waymo. And because you were curious, right? And you were kind of able to adapt from the previous ways that you knew and understood perhaps how to get from point A to point B in a vehicle. And you learned what it what it was about. And, I think about these different skills around critical thinking and, thinking broadly about, Bill's question around systems thinking and understanding how everything we do is connected. And because it's all connected, we can figure out innovative ways to solve problems, but it also makes it incredibly difficult to do so. And, you also, I think, when I think about learning, and I mean, beyond your experience, John, I think about the importance of self-directed learning in this time. We have a lot of people, I think, interested in our programs who are wondering whether they should go about getting a master's degree or a PhD in evaluation studies right now, or whether they should be pursuing other types of educational pursuits. And I usually say I think there's a helpful combination of both. And thinking about, what it looks like to, upskill or to refine your skill sets. There are just so many ways and just different things, I don't know, that different opportunities for people to engage in the evaluation space. With the internet, we can find more resources than ever, but it takes self-directed learning too, which I think comes in evaluation and curiosity, that goes, I think, beyond an assignment that you're doing in a class. So kind of, practicing and engaging with people who are a part of these broader systems in our classes, kind of are a part of that kind of training students, to engage with curiosity, with adaptability, with learning at the center, which is what evaluation is all about. And I mean, I could go on, and talking about all the skills that I think are, I'll stop there, but I truly just think about how the skills that we teach and that are important for future evaluators, to learn or I guess future evaluators to think about, or even current evaluators, right, to think about as we're thinking about how we are adapting to the current environment. They're applicable in so many other parts of our lives too. And I think those are a lot of the lessons we like to teach in our classes as well, just so that people don't see evaluation as a singular field or a singular act, but it's something that we are engaging with all the time on a daily basis.
Thanks for saying that, Jody. I didn't really think about my demonstrating learning there in that story I was telling about the robots, but I guess you're right. And I'll add to that. I started the process. I really was kind of scared. I wasn't kidding. I was afraid to get in that thing. I was afraid to walk in front of it. But after I got used to it a little bit, it was a bit exhilarating, and now it's a little boring. But I guess that's what learning can be like. When it comes to AIs, can I take a moment and talk about things coming in threes again?
Sure, John.
All right. And again, I don't mean to put AI applications in three buckets. It's just if you start getting into four and more, it gets to be a bit complicated for me to get my head around. But I was talking with Jody and Stuart. I was building out a syllabus recently, and they raised the issue of, well, I got to have an AI policy in my syllabus, and how are you going to use it? And it looks like the three buckets that are kind of emerging out of this is bucket one, stay medieval, don't use it at all. We're going to use blue book exams, and we're going to do things orally so you could avoid it. It's an option. Bucket two, use it for specific purposes. And in a course, I might say you could use AI for X, but not Y. And then bucket three is no, you can go ahead and dive in, be aware of how to operate these things, make sure you're aware that the product that you developed in a course or elsewhere, it's yours. And so your job is to make sure that you deal with things like hallucinations. Don't just take everything at face value. Otherwise, it's a tool. It's not going away so far as we know. And you may as well learn how to steer these things. And so thinking about those three buckets of AI application in courses as well as evaluation more broadly, I think I'd be prone to stick with bucket three, but I also keep my evaluator hat on, and I realize there might be some applications and scenarios where I want to see students be able to demonstrate. Students themselves want to be able to show that they can think through problems and they don't need AI, right? And so I can see different combinations of how we might use AI as we learn, as we evaluate. But I like this idea of being in control. Getting back to Waymos, maybe I wasn't steering the Waymo, but I was telling it where to go. And I had a purpose for how I was using it. And so I think the idea of seeing AI as tools still puts the user of those tools as the crafts person.
Yeah,
I really like that.
I just bid on RFP that actually explicitly said no AI for your qualitative data analysis. So, I mean, students need to know how to be able to do it without the AI, I think, at least for the time being anyway, because it's still the blue book option number one out there. So,
Yeah, that's interesting. I'm glad you raised that, Stacey. I thought about that too, because there have been times when I thought about analysis of data using large language models and how does that differ from, say, if you're going to use Deduce or another software
mm,
package. And here I am thinking in threes again. You could say I'm going to just use really old school. I'm going to read everything and conduct my qualitative analysis with a paper and pencil. I could use an existing stalwart program, or I could rely on AI. My reaction to that is in each one of those cases, we still have to remember we're using technology. Uh, Paper and pencil is a form of technology. It's just not digital.
mm,
But the other side to that is the last time I ran into a scenario like this, LLMs, large language model thinking was allowed, but I would be afraid to rely on it exclusively. So the plan we came up with was to get a random sample of text to make sure that we have humans review it using tried and true methods. And the idea would be to see if there's reliability between the two processes. And if there is, I would tend to trust it more. And if there wasn't, I would trust the humans more.
mm.
But that's kind of like evaluating the evaluation approach.
How meta.
It's very meta.
Yeah, I'm getting to a lot of meta stuff here.
Very meta. I feel like we're gonna have to say at the end, like at Sesame Street, this episode was brought to you by the number three.
This episode was brought to you by the number three because John can't think at the level of four.
I wanted to follow up on those comments, both about AI and about self-directed learning. So AI is potentially a great tool for self-directed learning. And I think that we have to move away from thinking about AI as something that we can rely on for expert answers. I don't think that we can, at a sophisticated level, rely on AI to do that. But if we properly understand it as a tool where we converse with it through we type in our inquiries in the chat at the chat box that you interact with AI. And so you get certain responses from certain output from the AI, and then you think, okay, that's not exactly what I wanted to know. And so then you have to refine the question and push the AI. And so it is a tool for self-directed learning. And so in terms of preparing future evaluators, I think that's perhaps one tip or piece of advice that I would give to new evaluators is to always think of yourself as learning new things. So learning doesn't stop with a graduate degree in evaluation studies. When you're in the program or even after you finish the program, for example, I think about statistical methods. So what a lot of students in graduate school don't realize is that even very experienced program evaluators have to teach themselves new methods. You cannot possibly know all of the statistical methods out there. And so what happens is you run into situations where you need to learn a new statistical method, and you have to teach yourself once you're out of school because there's no one else to do it for you. But we're in an age where we have just a wealth of resources for pursuing that self-directed learning. There are YouTube videos. There are all kinds of resources available on the internet. You can read, and then there's AI. And so you can teach yourself new statistical methods. And so that's just one example of how you could use AI for self-directed learning. But you can think of all kinds of, whether it's evaluation methods or broader issues about problems of practice, evaluation practice that you run into as an evaluator. And so, you have a question and, you could call up someone, a colleague, someone who has some experience with program evaluation and ask them, or you could ask the AI. And you could go through that same process that you would pursue in having a conversation with a smart person. And Just figure out what it is that you don't know, and you go out and you get that information. But that habit of self-directed learning is perhaps the most important habit to learn that will help you be a good program evaluator for the rest of your career.
Hey, and it's not just for learning new things, it's from reminding yourself. Right now, I'm teaching a course in more introductory quantitative methods, and it may not surprise folks that in the nature of this particular course, I've been encouraged to use SPSS, which is not really my go-to program, but it is for some things. But
Yeah.
it's been a while since I've run a couple of things. You all will recall that I started at the University of Minnesota last August, and before that, I was an evaluator where I had an army of statisticians who would do things for me. So I admit I got a little rusty with some issues, and so I was trying to figure out how to run some pretty simple stats that I know I can do in SPSS. I've done it before. I could find the manual. I could recreate it. Instead, I just went to AI and said, okay, how do I remind me, how do I select a given number of cases and run this procedure in split files? And like, how is it actually done in this software? And hallucinations weren't a concern because I could see right then and there that I was doing the things that are correct, right? And
Yeah.
there's a really nice matchup, and I'm sure I saved. And also the other thing I did too was I asked AI to produce a couple of data sets for me just to test some prospects out. And none of these things are new. Going to a manual, simulating some data just to make sure that you can remind yourself that you're doing things the right way in terms of software management. But it saved me, I don't know, probably 4 hours of my time.
Yeah, I took a course through MIT last year on AI, no code AI, and the data scientists that were teaching that were saying that they're all using AI. They're not just having R code popping out of their head anymore. They put it into AI to figure out what they need to do. So yeah, it's just the way it is.
Yeah.
I Yeah, I will say though, as we think about, your experience, Stacy, just kind of engaging with an RFP that did not allow, AI, and yet we will continue, I think, to see regulations around AI emerge and affect, the field of evaluation, education, et cetera. But it does always, bring me back, to humans and the reality that there always will be a need for human interaction in evaluation. We need to interpret, we need to engage, we need to be doing things like this to be able to learn from each other, so that we can have a better understanding of both where the field is going, but also how we want to shape the field. And so I think about, as we're navigating these really challenging times, the importance of coming together, alongside tools and technology. But it's, I think, more important to have this human connection now more than ever so that we can continue to both ask and answer questions and just connect with each other around many of the shared experiences that we are collectively and, of course, individually navigating. But it's important times for us to remember that we are humans and we have a lot to contribute, especially if we do it together.
Yeah, no, that's an excellent point. I mean, I think Bill and I both focus a lot on methodology, but evaluation does involve a lot of engagement with stakeholders, and so the human component is really important to consider in all of this. So, yeah.
And I've been also thinking a little bit about the job landscape as we move forward in if you allow three buckets, we have what we have now, right? Any listener doesn't really need me to describe the immediate environment, but I think moving forward, one other way of working is going to be there would be some semblance of this where it'll continue where I think it was actually a person named Rick Edelman who came up with this idea. He would refer to it as the New York or the Manhattan-based model of working. And that's where we're evaluators, we work for some company with a bunch of letters and we go into a building, we do our thing, and we all go home, and that's a little bit upended by things like Zoom and Microsoft Teams, but it's still basically the model, right? We work for a place, we stay there for a while, we get them to put money into our retirement plans for us, and we draw a paycheck. But then this is where I heard about it. I'm not sure Rick Edelman is credited with the idea, but he also referred to the notion of the Hollywood model. I'll think about that because again, I was just in LA and I got to see the Hollywood sign in person. That model is one where you have people with particular skill sets. You might be into pyrotechnics, so you have a job where you get to blow stuff up. And you might have another person with a particular set of skills where they are focused on, let's say, hair and makeup, and then someone else is doing wardrobe. And you bring these professionals together, and they work for a guild, and they have a craft, and they have things like shared projects, but they basically move from project to project. And so you might just finish filming the latest action hero summer blockbuster movie, but they're already moving on to the next thing. They're well beyond that. And so we might, in this world where we have folks who are skilled at using artificial intelligence to help them do things quickly, but they've demonstrated time in and time out that they're good about thinking through these things and they specialize in a particular area in the evaluative world. We might be looking at a Hollywood model for some folks where they've got their sort of boutique specialty and that's what they do. And so I don't know, nor can anybody really know what's going to come next. But I'll get back to that optimism idea that I was raising earlier. And that is for those of us who can think it through, we're probably going to be okay. I worry a little bit more about those of us who don't. They're used to their model. They don't like change. They can't handle it. That's going to be a recipe for early retirement, probably. But for the rest of us who can just sort of pay attention to what's happening, read, and that maybe that means that you reopen a small business. And maybe that means you end up doing really well at that. And maybe that means that you're no longer doing the New York model. And I think that that'll be okay.
Sort of what happened to me, so that sounds very optimistic.
You want to shout optimism from the guy who said you
Like
didn't
that,
Just to follow up on what John was saying, I think it's much broader than the evaluation field, but I think in professions generally, I think there's going to be this trend towards consulting, contract work, project-based work rather than permanent employment at one organization.
Yeah, and building on that, kind of like I was saying before, but maybe to say it a little better, I think there is going to be, especially as we continue to see the erosion of the existing evaluation job market as we knew it, or perhaps the changing, as we continue to see the changes, in the evaluation job market, especially in the nonprofit and philanthropic and public sectors, I really think about the need to be able to understand, like I guess, and Bill, I think I keep going back to your systems thinking perspective and having a good understanding of the broader systems that are influencing social problems and the evaluation challenges that we're facing, or the programs that are undergirding the reasons, or I don't know. I guess I'm mostly just like really thinking about the need for us to be able to have a good understanding of not just how to evaluate a program, but how the program works within the broader systems that we're working in, and how all of our political and economic and social systems are informing that program. So you can still have the skills, to rigorously and adequately assess whether or not, the program is meeting its intended goals for a mission-based organization. But you also have the broader context for how to provide recommendations to that organization within the context of the broader field that we're living in, so that these are realistic, practical recommendations. And so when I think about this, when I'm thinking about the future of our education, I'm thinking about, and kind of like as our program is designed, providing recommendations to students to, take a program evaluation course, but then, a program development or a program design course, perhaps focusing on nonprofit management or public management, so that people can have and speak not just methodological languages, but languages in the areas of management, civic life, and policy, whatever their interest might be, or as Stuart was sharing earlier, public health, education. We exist within a college of education and human development, and I think we truly do see the development of the field as, something that aligns in the broader, I guess, developmental sense. But I don't know. I guess I just see how it's all connected, and I see evaluation I think we need to continue to get creative within the context of these systems that are not necessarily working in evaluation's favor all the time. But I think we are going to have to like really think about multiple skill sets and having them in order to solve these challenging problems to begin with. So if evaluators are equipped with, additional skills and sets of knowledge that do honor and acknowledge the systematic challenges we're facing, they'll be well positioned, I think, to help the field, but also hopefully be better evaluators.
Yeah, I think that anyone entering the field will have to have a broad systems perspective. They're going to have to be flexible. They're going to have to be self-directed learners. They're going to have to be prepared to work as consultants in project-based situations. And they're also going to have to know how to use AI properly.
All right. Thanks, everyone. Thank you, John, Jody, and Stuart, for being here. We really appreciate it. And yes, this episode was brought to you by the number 3.
And can I say, if you remember anything, stay away from the number 4.
Stay away from the number 4.
Stay away from that 4. It's too
Stay
much.
away from 4. All right. And we'll provide contact information for John, Jody, and Stuart in the notes. And yeah, and Bill and I are on Facebook, LinkedIn, Blue Sky, Instagram. Our companies have websites because we're both consultants. I guess we're kind of like prepared for the future already as being consultants. All right. Thanks, everybody.
Thank you, Stacy and Bill. Thank you for the opportunity.